Our next speaker is Elizabeth Riley, and she will be talking about linguistic quality. It is a marriage, not an affair. Elizabeth has worked in a variety of roles since starting her localization career in 2004 as a linguistic QA manager. Since then, she has held a range of positions on both the client and vendor sides, including localization engineer, account manager, and sales manager. Since September 2019, Elizabeth has been working in the VistaTech sales team as Director of Solutions Architecture, where she can put to use her wide-ranging experience helping create enterprise localization programs for new global customers. Elizabeth, the audience is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, David. I appreciate the introduction. Okay, let me start sharing my screen, in fact. Actually, let me get that here. Okay, all right. Thanks for the introduction, David. Okay, so first, thanks everybody for joining the webinar. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to speak here today, especially at Gala. But I want to start off with just a quick poll. I'm curious to find out what drew you all to attend this webinar. So start off and get you guys participating a little bit. Got a little questionnaire here. So can we do the poll? Do we have the question available? If not, I can just read these and you can sort of. Okay. Do we have that?
No, I'm afraid I do not see these. So
Okay.
do you want to speak them out and have people use the chat to respond?
Yeah, it's just a quickie. So, okay, I was just curious why people are attending the webinar. So the options are, you're interested in language quality in general, you're always having quality issues with your LSP or your vendor, and you thought this webinar might help you understand why that is. Another option is you've lost a lot of clients because of quality issues, but it's never your fault. And the final option is that you're not really sure why you're attending, but something about affairs in the title of the webinar caught your eye. So, a fun little question here. So I don't know if we can actually improvise making a poll, but you can see if there's any way we can get a sense.
Some people are saying the last option is what they.
Very good. I'm happy to hear that, actually.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's perhaps the first day of Gala, so you're looking for something a little bit new and interesting, so that's good. Okay, so thank you for weighing in, and thank you for helping me improvise with the poll questions there, David. Okay, so now that I know why, largely, in some degree, why you guys are attending the session, I'm going to tell you briefly what made me want to present this topic. So as David said, I've been in localization for about 15 years now. And again, I started out as a linguistic quality assurance manager, working in a medical translation company that dealt mainly with medical device clients. And I've always liked languages, but I never really thought I could get a job that made use of them. So I consider myself actually pretty lucky to find that position. Even though the work itself can be kind of routine, LQA, especially for translations of something like highly technical medical device instructions, is actually pretty tedious, and it requires that you have really strong focus and attention to detail, which you have to maintain as long as you're doing the QA task. And so I did want to do another poll. It sounds like we don't have that, but in any case, maybe we can find a way to just improvise. I wanted to ask what people's roles are here in the localization business. So just these standard 5 categories, actually. Are you client side? Are you localization buyer? Do you represent an LSP or a localization vendor? Are you a technology provider? Are you somebody from university or academia? Or are you a translator? So I'm not sure if there's a way that we can kind of find out.
So people are saying that everything, LSP, client side.
Great.
Yeah, LSP, client, buyer,
Great.
technology
Okay.
vendor.
Okay, very good.
Translator,
Oh, good.
buyer, KPIs. You're being bombarded.
Great. Okay, that's very good. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that we had a little bit of a range of exposure here, especially now I'm going to give you a little bit of description of what this linguistic QA manager job was like for those of you who do not work in this and never have and could never imagine doing so. So my job as a linguistic QA manager involved comparing translations in French or German, which were my 2 main languages, against the English source. So in a simple Word file, with 3 columns. So most of the day, I'd sit at my desk and check these translations segment by segment, and then row by row. And if I ever found anything that looked like an error, I'd have to flag it, write it up, and then categorize the error to have the translator review it and possibly correct it. So if you can imagine, this wasn't necessarily the most fun or the most entertaining job, but it did allow me, again, to use languages to earn a living. So I stuck with this for quite some time. And ultimately, it had the effect of really centering me in my career in matters of language quality. So I became really very quality-centric. So I did that for almost 9 years. I did a little bit of other quality type of work afterwards, but eventually, as you said in my intro there, David, thank you, I moved to other roles that were more client-facing. So all the same, because of that background and all those years that I spent doing and thinking about linguistic QA, that quality piece was always really interesting to me, especially if my accounts have quality issues. So let me just preface this next part here by saying I never have worked in, and I never did work in a company where you'd expect major nonconformances or truly awful translations, right? Like anywhere on the client side that I have worked, always had a very rigorous quality system in place, from ISO certifications to QMS to quality management system, for those of you who don't know, all those localization acronyms, to varying levels of linguistic quality assurance and control over the entire project process. So in ways, if you have all that in place, all these controls that are designed to demonstrate to clients, right, that they will get high quality translations, it's actually kind of surprising that you ever end up with major issues on an account, right? I mean, so again, I'm not talking about perfection, because translation is, despite whatever advances in technology we have, we can debate that at some other time, whether you think about robots taking over people translating. Translation is still largely a human process. And humans, being fallible, do not produce perfect translations as a matter of course. So on the one hand, it's actually not surprising that translations are usually not perfect, but you still should receive quality that is fit for purpose. So I personally thought it was strange that even in companies where you have good translations teams, reliable processes, consistent workflows, and a decent quality system in place, you'd still end up getting these problems, right? These complaints about quality from your customers. Oh, this looks like Google Translate. Oh, this is awful. Is this person even a native speaker? You know, stuff like that, right? I really like to hear if you guys have other examples that are worse, or if you said such things that are worse. I'm sure that there are many among you in the audience who have experienced things like this, or perhaps said them to your vendor, or wanted to. So that's the one part of this talk. Aside from this long-standing interest I've had in languages, which led me to working in the translation field, I've also always been interested in psychology, and in particular relationships. I became more interested in relationships when one of my significant relationships, a marriage in fact, began to fall apart a few years ago. So I sort of obsessively began reading about what makes for high quality marriages and what contributes to low quality ones. So high quality being sort of vague here, like a vague definition, but just quickly for the purposes of our discussion, so we're clear on what that means. Let's just say it's a relationship in which both parties feel generally good about the direction of things, you feel supported by one another, you have trust, and generally a feeling of mutual goodwill towards the other person, even if there are still disputes or disagreements, right? Like it's not perfect, but it's good enough. So I read a lot about this, and I came to discover that some people working in the field of psychology and relationship counseling had actually managed to study marriages, like they study couples, like what you do is an actual lab, right? But the reason why they would do this is to determine to some degree of accuracy what specific behaviors resulted in low quality marriages, which in turn were likely to fail, but also to identify the types of behaviors that resulted in high quality marriages. So those were the ones that would go the distance. So I found this pretty interesting, and even if in my research I didn't manage to learn anything that saved my particular relationship, I did at least walk away with the knowledge that there are certain risk factors, which are behaviors that people do that create bad relational outcomes. But they can be identified, and they can also be changed, and if you do those things, then you can actually maybe manage to save or salvage a relationship. So this is a good thing, right? Like this is the old knowledge is power. If you know what things make a relationship bad, you can identify or maybe even stop or prevent them, right? Okay, so at some point, I realized this didn't just apply to marriages, it could perhaps apply to other types of relationships. Being someone who is working in translation and localization, dealing with customers who sometimes complain or even break up with you over translation quality, I considered that in addition to the typical risk factors we account for already very well, which I've listed here on the slide, just a few, right? That maybe there are relational risk factors that we should consider also when it comes to language quality. Now, just as another little aside, it sounds kind of weird actually, and perhaps a little bit alarming, because this isn't actually supposed to be the case. So some type of relational factor really shouldn't be something that determines the quality of translation, strictly speaking. You know, we put systems and standards in place in order to harmonize things such that this type of outcome, like a poor translation, doesn't occur just because a different person is at the helm, right? I hope that's, you know, that perhaps is clear, but, you know, like it could be the process is what's supposed to dictate the quality, not the people. That's different translator, equally qualified for whichever subject or domain you're trying to address, should not produce a wildly different result from another translator. Different PM, same. You know, you can imagine all types of actors within the typical project space. So the person should not determine the quality of the outcome. So that part actually, it really isn't supposed to matter. So it's again, it's this process, not people. You get results that are consistently good, perhaps not perfect, but quality that's fit for the intended purpose. But so when you keep seeing this type of thing happen, this old bad translation occurring within the confines of this controlled system and the defined processes that you have, you really start to sort of suspect that maybe there's something else that's happening. And that's what led me to this idea of a relational risk factor, which, like these other risk factors we account for, it could in some way affect quality. So I thought that if you looked at the client-vendor relationship and tried to see patterns, sort of like how those psychology and relationship researchers had studied married couples, you might be able to come up with certain behaviors on both the client side and the vendor side, which contributed to difficulties in the relationship that would in turn have an effect on quality and also satisfaction in general, right? So with that information, that maybe you could determine what, if anything, you could do about this. So I obviously could not study client-vendor relations the way that marriages had been studied in a lab, but I felt like experience and some anecdotal evidence would be sufficient to draw some general conclusions here. So I'd also talked about this with a lot of colleagues, and they enjoyed this talk as well. And it seemed like you kind of start to easily identify some troublesome behaviors on both sides, which I'd like to kind of take a look at now. And hopefully if we have a little bit of time at the end for a discussion, I'd love to hear what other things that people think are relational risk factors on both respective sides. Okay, so starting with the client side, not for any particular reason, just starting there. What are the main things that clients may do that negatively affect the relationship and in turn could affect the quality? Okay, so one of the things is, you know, I've listed a few things here. I'm going to kind of state them in a different way. Not considering that the vendor is really a critical part of your extended team. Like clients may often not want to bring them in as closely into their inner circle as they can. And this won't really allow your vendor to be as good as they can be. So just really consider doing that. Some extensions of these things are like not bothering to understand what you're buying from your vendors. You know, like maybe they don't understand the individual services, the purview of localization. Or perhaps not also understanding the value of the partnership itself. Insufficient joint planning is another thing that I've seen with clients, like, you know, giving out communication or information on a need-to-know basis, not providing enough, just a little bit of information or information that comes too late. Another thing that can occur, you know, not enough transfer of knowledge or project details that allow us on the vendor side to determine our requirements and develop custom solutions. Like this is a very frequent thing. You know, you sort of think that all these details may not be significant to the task of localization, but ultimately they can be really valuable for a lot of reasons. You know, and also a key thing that, you know, we see is we by being on the vendor side is clients not really making themselves available to support throughout the project with answers to questions or resolution of issues and queries. And of course, this is normal, right? Like people who manage localization on the client side may or may not be localization managers. Certainly they have other things to do, but this is something that can affect quality in a very clear way. A certain thing that seems to occur more recently is this unfortunate trend towards unit costs over overall value of what you're buying. So recognizing that when you're buying translations or localizations, you're not just buying words or pages of DTP that are put in other languages. You're, you know, ultimately you're buying, you know, sort of a relational aspect of loyalty and flexibility and the openness that you get from working with a particular vendor. Okay, so those are just a few. right? I'm hoping that if we have a discussion, we can talk about others as well. Okay, going over to what happens on the vendor side, which I am more familiar with. I've only left a few things here, but again, got a few here on my bullet point list, but I'm going to just discuss them in a free form. One of the things I find that happens on the vendor side is an overestimation of our abilities or capability or capacities, right? Like this is a clear one that can lead to quality problems in that, like maybe it's just not something you're qualified to do, the subject matter or the languages or the particular process or the tools that are used. And you know, that's a clear problem. But it still occurs all the same. Not establishing really a proper rapport or, you know, having proactive communications with a customer. Like this is kind of something that happens perhaps as a result of being too shy or sort of subservient attitude. This can manifest in a lot of ways, like holding back up front at the outset of a relationship, holding back on getting to know as much as possible about the customer and their requirements. This can be achieved in a variety of ways by anything from asking for reference materials or product training, a chance to meet the team, not just the main stakeholders, right, but also people on the ground, like those who are developing the products, writing the content, anything involving whatever it is you're actually localizing for them. Then another aspect of this is not cross-checking your assumptions, like just making sure that what you assume to be correct as it relates to your project is correct. Not being proactive in engaging the customer in the development of linguistic assets or, you know, things like terminology or style guides. This can occur just because there's, you know, perhaps lack of time, of course, lack of resources, but, you know, also maybe an unwillingness to take the time to educate on the essential nature of these assets as it relates to quality in the project process. And another thing that can occur within the, you know, sort of the broad lines of what we're talking about here, raising linguistic queries or asking enough questions. So first of all, like there's a variety of ways you could talk about this. Raising the queries in a timely manner so that you can confirm your understanding them, obviously at a correct time, such that they can be handled during the process or the project. And also, you know, making sure that you clearly understand the source content. Raising other queries that come up across a project process that would affect the final deliverable quality. You know, sometimes there's just, you know, this perception of being rushed and not wanting to appear as though you don't know what you're doing or not wanting to bother the customer. But those things are clearly, they can be detrimental in the end. So there's sort of a balance that should be played. And again, this, you know, not being assertive enough or having a sort of a deferential attitude towards the customer. I think that this is probably an extension of that old idea of the customer always being right. But, you know, service does not equal servant. So I think that in the localization space, particularly on the vendor side where I work, it's important to recommend that the highest performing teams are looking for a partner who can provide strategic and tactical advice, not just execute on what the customer is asking them to do. So now, finally, what I think that, how this relates to the overall theme here, you know, you kind of have to ask yourself what it is that you're building. Like, are you trying to, is this a transactional relationship with this person or this agency who's conducting a relationship, or are you just getting money from them? You're building a partnership, right? You know, this is what we're talking about. And then this attitude of, well, what's in it for me, right? Like if you're looking at it from a transactional standpoint, you know, you may not consider the other person's side, what they're benefiting, or what kind of benefit they need to obtain from you. This attitude of, it's not my problem, you know, like there's something going on the client side, perhaps that you fail to take into account, lacking empathy, or conversely with your vendor, like not really caring what could be happening that is affecting your account. And generally, I think that, you know, can sort of categorize these things into a lot of like some of the behaviors that I mentioned before. There's like a lack of transparency, a certain amount of secrecy, a lack of trust, you know, just a really sort of like, you know, not a real partnership, just transactional, two individuals sort of getting what they need from one another rather than building something together. And hence that's, you know, kind of why I came to this theme, you know, quality translations and localizations of these programs that are really high performing and doing exactly what everyone wants, that are achieving really good results. This is sort of a marriage, and that's not an affair. It's a partnership that's cultivated and nurtured, in which both parties feel heard and understood. It's not free of disputes or disagreements, but it's generally good enough, and the intent is that it'll continue as long as it's meaningful for both sides. So one thing that is a sort of a final point that I wanted to just bring that relates back to actually the the relationship counseling piece is that when we're talking about this sort of thing, what I think is really important is to not play the blame game and say, oh, you know what, my client does all of those things. They're always doing that stuff, therefore it is not my problem at all. Look at yourself first. Like in any relationship, what you can really change is only your reaction or your response to the situation. If there's something you're not happy with and the other party is not doing anything about it, what you can do is change your approach to it. So essentially, if you want to change others, start with yourself. This is a key tenet that you learn when you're trying to actually rebuild a relationship that is on the rocks, and it applies there, but also here. Let's look at ourselves and see what we can be doing better or differently before we point fingers at the other side, whether we're clients or vendors or even, you know, translators and others who are affected in the translation space. Okay, and finally, just to kind of sum up here, the way that I see that repeatable success, translation quality is really built on a solid foundation of partnership. You're working together, you have each other's interests in mind, there's empathy and understanding, you know, not without dispute, but again, a partnership rather than some sort of transactional thing in which just you're left with a feeling of dissatisfaction. Okay, so David, thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. This is a very, I don't know if I would like to say provoking, but very eye-catching topic for sure. And we have some few questions from the audience that I would like to start reading to you. The first question is from Luz. She says, earlier you talked about unrealistic expectations. What makes an expectation realistic? It is time, amount of context information, examples?
Okay, well, that obviously depends on the circumstance, but expectations that are unrealistic are things that are probably cannot be done by either side, right? Like, you know, if you have a project that cannot realistically be executed within the time frame that you're specifying, or perhaps you're looking to get something done and with a budget that is insufficient to complete all of the work. So it really depends. You know, those are just a couple of examples that come off the top of my head. You know, I'm sure anybody who's worked in this business has either you know, had multiple experiences of what they consider unrealistic, but it really just depends. Like, oh, can we get this done in a week? Like, well, it depends on what it is, right? The things that are just really not capable of being done within the usual throughput that you carry them out. So from the vendor side, at least.
Okay. The next question is from Kirill. What is your take on quality self-certification programs at LSPs? Should buyers trust their vendors to run independent QAs on their own deliveries, or should buyers opt for a third-party QA instead?
That's a really interesting question. I feel like you could actually do a whole webinar on something like that. I mean, obviously, you know, that's a sort of a self-reporting bias, right? Like anytime that you're providing a service, if you're also providing some assurance of the veracity of it, there's, you know, there's a, I can't think of the word, there's a disconnect there, but I think it just really depends on a lot of factors. Self-reporting, I mean, you can engage a third party, but you know, third party may or may not be better than the vendor themselves. It depends on the subject matter, and it depends on the type of project, and it also depends on the expertise of the third party. I mean, I've been in situations where a third party has been engaged to sort of verify the quality of something, and the third party does not have sufficient authority to really determine that based upon what's actually happening in the project. So you have to, I think, again, with everything, like you have to evaluate the project conditions and the individual variables to figure out these sort of things. Like who are you going to get in the absence of the vendor to verify it? Are they sufficiently qualified to determine this? Do you have trust in them? One of the things that's really interesting about quality, to mostly on the buyer side, is that quality is invisible, and that's the reason for these things, right? Like an independent sort of auditor to confirm what you're getting. But my answer, it's not just to be diplomatic, it's just that it really depends. I think it can be a good thing, but it can also be less than useful in certain situations.
We have a question from Michael. With less sophisticated localization clients, how do establish trust when they don't know anything else, or maybe had a bad experience before?
That's a good question. I can relate to this from my experience, not in this realm, but having contractors doing different pieces of work on my house. Like there are things that I'm very, very ill-informed about. Like I don't know anything about plumbing, for example. I don't know anything about electricity. So I think it's kind of it's incumbent upon me to learn as much as I can to the extent possible about any of those things before I go about engaging someone to procure their services. Obviously, I'm at an information disadvantage. I'll never be able to attain the level of expertise that a provider of these services has. But I think it's incumbent upon less sophisticated or less mature clients to do a little bit of, sort of reading and research to find out about it. But also, like I think that most of the companies I have worked with, the big LSP players, they're usually happy to educate customers in a positive and non-judgmental way on localization process and overall expectations that they can have. I mean, there's a perception that I think that if you go to an LSP and ask for advice, then you'll end up walking away buying something, but I don't find that as the case. I think that most of the people that I've worked with have been forthright and transparent and genuinely willing to help customers. So if you've had a bad experience, then I can relate to that. I would say try not to be jaded about it and try someone else with whom you do have a good experience.
The next question is from Chris Stubbs. What's your advice on how to best engage the vendors, such as freelancers or smaller LSPs, and get their buy-in to support the larger LSP clients' marriage?
That's a tough question. How do you get smaller, how do you sort of get them on board to kind of be part of the army? That's a tough question. I don't know if that's within the expertise that I possess to answer effectively, but I do, having worked on that side with a lot of individual freelancers, I do know that they are usually quite proud of their work, and they sometimes resist being grouped into any sort of category of individuals in which their own utility as artisans of their craft is limited. That I don't know if I can answer, but I think that one of the things that I have seen that works well is treating them fairly, treating them humanely, and giving them as much respect as you perhaps would give the client, as strange as that may sound, but they are the ones who are doing the work for you. So in my experience, that's something that has worked.
The next question is, how do you build a healthy balance when one side is willing to give everything and the other side is not as committed? What do you do if it's up to you, I guess?
Well, so I'm not sure if this person is asking about the localization business or something else, but I think that the answer would apply in either case. If you are giving too much, then stop giving as much. If you're not getting anything, then stop giving what you're getting. I know that sounds extremely oversimplified, but I quite frankly, I do think that that's actually an answer that is applicable. If either side, whether it's a client or a vendor, feels that they're overextended, then quite simply, I think the answer is to stop overextending yourself and see what you get in return. I'd be happy to talk more about this if anybody wants to. Yeah. Please find me on LinkedIn.
We have 2 minutes and 2 questions.
Okay.
Let's speak quickly on that. Catherine, have you ever had to defend QA, example, in a project where speed, etc., overweights concerns about QA? How do you approach advocating for it?
How do I approach advocating for either one, or sort of like, I guess maybe the question the person is asking is how do you sort of overcome competing demands to get to what they're doing? I mean, the obvious answer, which is the only really one that seems to work, is just to communicate clearly and say, listen, if you want all these 3 things, of which only 2 are possible within the constraints of what you're offering, then this is what you're going to get. But I have had that happen. I've been forced into that situation, and it's usually turned out badly. So push back when you can, and if obviously sometimes you do not win all battles. So go back and cry with your colleagues afterwards.
And the last question: have you ever had a customer who has reacted negatively to you trying to be more assertive about what you need to be able to provide quality?
Yes.
What did you went about it?
I absolutely have had that experience. I've had that many times, and it always makes me feel sort of like I have done something untoward. I'm not necessarily that type of person in my life in general, and so I always feel that I've done something wrong. But ultimately, I try to remind myself if I'm doing what I feel is right within the constraints of what I'm trying to provide to the customer or what I think is best for them, then If they push back, that is their prerogative. They're the one who's paying for it, but at least I have said my piece and tried to tell them what I think would be best.
Thank you again, Elizabeth, for a great presentation. Now let's